Thank you, Doctor, for the very eye-opening, very insightful sharing. Okay, we hope to see you back again really soon, Doctor. Okay, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Stay safe.
Thank you, Doctor. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, and now let me introduce our second invited speaker, Emeritus Professor Dr. Graeme Britton from the Raffles University, Singapore, for his presentation. Please welcome Dr. Britton.
Thank you. Just give me a moment to share my screen.
Sure, Doctor.
And play. Oops. Just give me a moment. I've just got to pull this down. Okay. That's clear now. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Dato Ahmed for inviting me to speak at this conference. In his opening address, Dato Ahmed mentioned the lack of support for the arts, the fact that the arts are not held in very high regard in the community, not like economics, and also how difficult it is to promote art into the community. And I fully agree with these comments. It is very, very difficult. And what I'm going to talk about today is my own approach to promoting art in the community. And I call this everyday art, and I'm going to discuss the philosophy behind it and actual practices, and I'll show you some examples from professional artists and also from our student work. And so let's move on. Now, the philosophy behind my approach is a branch of aesthetics known as environmental aesthetics, and it is quite different from mainstream traditional aesthetics. First of all, it includes the natural environment. So now the range of artworks has been extended from those created by humans to what exists in nature. The implication of this is that there is no artist. So a lot of traditional aesthetics, there's a lot of focus on the artist, what the artist intended and how the observer is supposed to interact with the artist and so on. But in nature, there is no artist, and therefore the focus of attention is purely between the artwork and the observer. And this has some big implications. The second aspect is that in order to appreciate nature, you need to get there. And so it brings in the notion of human-powered aesthetics. So you walk through a forest, or you climb a mountain, or you canoe a river, and so on. And then finally, and this is really important, is that artworks are not considered in isolation. So for example, if you go to a museum and you look at a painting on the wall, you're just looking at that painting. You're not looking at anything else. But when you're looking at urban environments, and this is what I'm particularly concerned about, you've got to consider the artwork, the new building, in relation and in context with all the other buildings in that area. And so the whole notion of environmental aesthetics is that you don't consider an artwork in isolation, you have to consider it in terms of the environment as well. So now I'm going to discuss three major features of the approach to implementing the everyday art. Okay, the first one is bad art versus good art. And I need to cover this because environmental aesthetics takes a particular viewpoint on what they consider to be bad art and good art. And it may not necessarily comply with what other artists say. It's actually quite controversial topic, I have to say. Okay, so first of all, if we look at this, good art. So good art produces a positive aesthetic response. And by that, I mean it creates a mood of satisfaction or it creates a mood of dissatisfaction. That's the function of art. And it makes us more human. Now, one of the interesting parts that comes in from the environmental perspective is that art involves more than one sense. Now, I'm not saying that each artwork has to involve more than one sense, but in general, artwork as a whole, art as a whole, has to involve more than one sense. I do believe that we do need more artworks that do involve more than one sense, and I'm going to give some examples later. It also brings in the notion that art has to be appropriate and relevant to the environment that it's in, and then good artworks are the traditional ones like the sacred, the sublime, beautiful artworks, and ugly artworks. Now, what is really important about this whole approach is that there is a positive feedback loop here. If we want people to appreciate art more, then we have to develop their skill to appreciate art. And so what happens here is with the positive feedback loop is if you have a positive aesthetic response to an artwork, this increases your ability to appreciate art. And this in turn helps you to have a better positive response, and this increases your skill. So like all skills, art appreciation has to be learned. And this is a very, very powerful positive feedback loop. Now let's look at bad art. Sorry, sorry, I've jumped too far. Okay, so this is the positive feedback loop. So some examples of good art. I've taken two examples, one a very old example from architecture. This is the Trevi Fountain in Rome. It was completed in 1762. The architects were Salvi and Panini. Salvi died before it was completed, and then Panini finished it. Now, this is beautiful artwork. It's in fact the most famous fountain in the world, and it's contextually relevant in that it fits in with the building that it was designed against. So again, this is an exemplification of what we mean by good art. Now I move to a recent one, which is the Park Royal Hotel in Singapore, which was designed by Woha architects. Again, this is a beautiful building, and it is completely in context. What you can't see is actually in the foreground is Hong Lim Park. So what they've done is they've carried the park theme into the building. So this is a really beautiful building, and we need more of these kinds of buildings in our urban environments. Now I come to negative art, the bad art. So bad art is obviously the opposite of the good. And in this case, there is either no aesthetic response or it's negative. And by that, I mean, there is no mood created. What happens is that you simply say, so what? Or this is awful, this is horrible, I want to get out of here. I don't want to look at this anymore. This is really, really awful. And by doing that, it makes us less human. So this is really not good for us either. It also brings in that it's not appropriate. So it may not fit in, it may not be appropriate or relevant. There's deceptive artworks, there's trivial, there's the banal, there's the trite. So a couple of examples of bad art in a moment. What I want to look at now is the positive feedback loop that we get with bad art. And what happens here is if you don't respond aesthetically, or you have a negative response, which means you turn away, what this does is it reduces your ability to appreciate art. And then by reducing your ability, you are less likely to want to look at artworks. And this is the real danger here. We have a lot of bad art in our urban environments, and people are meeting it day by day. And as you go to work, as you go out to the market, and as you go out to eat and so on. And by having this reinforcement, people are less likely to want to appreciate art. And this is the real challenge that we face, because we want them to appreciate art, because if they appreciate art, they will value art. So that's the challenge that we face. And so this, I'll give you some examples. Here's a ghetto in the USA. Now look at this street. There's nothing in there that you could say is nice or aesthetic. You're not going to sit out there on your porch and saying, I'm enjoying this street. It's just not going to happen. That's just not the way it is. Here's another example, a drain. Again, you're not going to sit and look at this drain and enjoy it and say, this is a really nice drain. And yet there's no reason why you can't still provide the same engineering function. So the function of a drain is to channel water away when there's a heavy rain. There's no reason why you can't change the drain into something different. And here's the example of how you can do it. Now, this is from Singapore. Now, you'll see there the top photo, 2008, it's a stormwater drain. It's a massive drain because there's an industrial district not far away, and it needs to channel the water from it. The area here is Bishan Angmo Keo Park in Singapore. So that, to me, the top one is bad art. Again, you're not going to sit there and enjoy that drain. So what they did is they commissioned some international landscape designers, and they converted the drain into a floodplain, which is in the bottom picture, labeled 2012. So the photos have been taken from the same position. Now you can see there's a total difference here. You've got a river flowing through it, so it's meandering. They have planted plants that can withstand water, so that when this floods, all the green that you see at the very bottom of the screen will be covered. But what happens is that the grass and the plants and the trees and the rocks in the river slow the water down. So it still transmits the water away and gets rid of the floodwaters, but it does so in a safer way. And obviously it creates a very, very nice environment. There are fish in the river, and even the otters that they have in Singapore now come in and feed there. So this is an example of what can be done. The top is bad art, the bottom is good art. So the first strategy that I'd like to suggest is we need to prevent bad art and promote good art. And by preventing bad art, we can obviously through the education process, we can teach the students what counts as good art and the art in the context of the environment. And that's one really good way of trying to prevent it, because if the students come out and produce good artworks, then you're only going to get good artworks. You're not going to get bad ones. Furthermore, we can promote good art. And in this case, we, through the teaching of the students, we make sure that they only produce good art, and we can speak out, academics can speak out against bad art and say, this is bad art, this should not be here, and they can try and improve the urban environments. Now, I can only speak generally here because there's so many issues involved around here, but at least that's the whole basis of what we want to do, is to prevent bad art and promote good art. Okay, so now I go to the second feature. This should be obvious. Art should be for everyone, and it should be democratic. Unfortunately, our social systems in the art world are such that they are controlled by a few people. So art is generally produced by the elite for the elite. And I give 3 examples here. You take Hollywood. Hollywood is controlled by a few major movie houses and a few key people. We've seen that in recent times with all the scandals and so on coming out. And they have absolute power. They determine what movies we're going to see. They determine who are going to be the successful actors and actresses. You and I, we have no say in this at all. If we look at the music world and look at what's happening with Taylor Swift today, the same thing is happening. It's very tightly controlled by a few record labels, and they have total control. They manipulate the copyright and hold it, even though it's the artist's work. And this is the argument Taylor Swift has at the moment, and she's re-recording her work so that she can take control back. Okay, so there's a big battle going on there with her. And then even more, this example is even worse. It's Tamara Durlin-Picker. Now, I don't know if many of you know who she is. I will not be surprised if you don't. And the reason is that she was a very, very famous and well-known artist in the 1920s and 30s. She was part of the Paris School because she was based in Paris. And during that time, as I said, she was world-renowned, and she knew all the major aristocrats, the princes, the counts, the dukes, and so on in Europe. She was very, very famous, and her artwork is beautiful, absolutely beautiful. But after the Second World War, if you look at art encyclopedias, art histories, no mention of Tamara Durlin-Picker, completely just not considered important. And who did that? Well, the art historians, the experts, they just considered that her work was not good enough to be included. And so we didn't know anything about her. Now her reputation has been restored. Her works are now the second highest selling to Georgia O'Keeffe. If you want to buy her works now, you're talking tens of millions of dollars. But who restored her reputation? Wasn't the experts. It was 3 entertainers: Jack Nicholson, Barbra Streisand, and Madonna. And so it's great that they have brought it back. That's some democracy in action there. but we need to restructure the major way in which artworks are put out into the community, how they're controlled in the community, so that it is democratic and it is for everyone. So the strategy 2A then is we need to promote art for everyone, and something that I've been doing, and I know Data Ahmed has been doing as well. So let's look at some positive things. There are some really positive features here, and one of them is the streaming services. So I've given an example of Netflix, which I'm very familiar with. Now, Netflix produces local movies. So that means a small filmmaker in Malaysia can produce a production that will be accepted on Netflix. It'll be in local language, and it'll be local actors and actresses. This is really, really good, and it can reflect the local culture. And Netflix will show it. And then if they think it has a potential for an international audience, they'll dub it into different languages and they can promote it internationally. That is truly democratic. What is even more democratic is if you take a TV series, whether the series continues or not is determined by the viewers. If they are watching the movie and lots of people watch the movie, then Netflix will continue the series. If nobody watches it, they will cancel it. But now it's the viewers determining what they consider to be art, not a few media moguls who say this is art and we're going to ignore the rest. The other change that's happening is that many companies now sponsor art. They want artworks in their offices and so on, and they actually sponsor artwork. So now you don't just have to go through a few galleries and so on. It is possible to get sponsorship from corporations, and you can get private sponsors through crowdfunding and non-fungible tokens. So this is changing now the range of sponsors that are now available for artists to get funded for art and to get their artwork out there. And lastly, I'll just touch on tourism and retail. Obviously, the tourist industry, you have hotels and restaurants, and they often promote local artists so that they put artworks on the walls of their buildings and so on, and that's really good. And the other one is retail. You'll see now, obviously people need to wear clothes and that, but there's no reason why artworks can't be on clothes. So if you look at Uniqlo, for example, they did a series on Hokusai. So for those of you that don't know, Hokusai is a very famous artist that lived in the 1800s, and he did a whole series of screen prints, the most famous one being The Great Wave of Kanagawa, 1823. If we look at more recently, Banksy is trying to support a cause, and so he's done an artwork, and he's now selling limited edition t-shirts to support his cause. So again, you can use the fashion industry to support artists in other areas of art. Now, strategy 2B is that we need to develop everybody's ability to appreciate art. So we don't have to make everybody an artist. That's never going to work, because some people just don't have that ability. But there's no reason why everyone cannot appreciate art. If you take nature, people go, I mean, and tourist industries are built around this, people watching sunsets, sunrises, and so on. So we need to develop everybody's ability to appreciate art. And how do we do that? Again, this comes from the environmental perspective. As I mentioned before, in order to appreciate nature, you use a human-powered activity. You can go walking, hiking, canoeing, climbing, cycling, and so on. These activities that we do in nature, we can also do in urban environments. So we can walk through a city. And as you walk through a city, you'll get the sights, the sounds, and the smells, multiple senses involved, and you get to appreciate the art. Now, you're only going to walk through a city if it's beautiful and has beautiful things in it. So we need to have a beautiful environment to do that. The other thing that comes out of this wandering is that you can create artworks that stimulate multiple senses and involve you in wandering through them. And I'm a great fan of interactive art for this reason. And I think we need to have more interactive art, because we need to motivate people to even start to appreciate art, and it's hard to do. So trying to take people to a museum or art gallery may be very difficult, but if you have something fun and exciting in the urban environment, people will naturally engage with this. So here's some examples. This first one is pavement art. It's in the Netherlands, and you can see this was just a normal street with just a boring road and everything in it, but now with the street art, it's interesting. You can't go to the street and not not be get some response. It's obviously going to give you a response. And as you walk down it, you're going to see different artwork as you walk down the street. Here's another example. This is called 3D mapping. So what they do is they have an existing building. There's a real building there. And then at night, you can project some sort of strange image on it to create an interesting effect. So that means as people are walking along the street, they see this. And again, naturally, they're going to be engaged. More importantly, look at this one. This is quite famous. It's 6,000 light bulbs done as a cloud. Now you'll see cords hanging down from it. Each of the cords has a switch at the bottom. So as you group together to view this installation, people can switch the light bulbs on and off. And of course it changes, but it's interactive. It engages people. So this is very, very powerful. Okay, so now I go to my third point. Art should be based in the community. That is, we need art everywhere, but should be based in the community first and foremost. And that's how I started out on this approach when I was at Raffles University. I wanted to push the art out from the university into the community. I also wanted to bring the community into the university, but I'm focusing now on going out from the university into the community. So what we need to do is promote artworks everywhere, but start with the local community. And universities play a key role here. And here's some examples. So this is student work from Raffles University. This is in a shopping centre. Now, in a shopping centre, you have to have columns to support the floors, and normally they're just painted white and they're very, very boring. So what we did is we worked with the shopping centre, and you can see there's 3 columns that have been we've got created artworks. These are 3D artworks, they're not 2D. And so again, it's livened up the shopping centre, and it's also helped to promote the student work, which is good for the students, and it's helped to promote the university. Here's another example. This is in a condominium. If you see at the top left, you'll see the students painting. There were 4 like walls like that, and they were just white. And the management said, well, it's pretty boring. People going through here, there's nothing to entertain them or interact with them. And so what the students did is they've created one artwork on each of the 4 walls, and the theme was endangered animals, and you can see the result of the artwork here. And of course, this was all directed under one of the staff, Dr. Tarani, because obviously, you know, the students need guidance to do this, but if they do this kind of thing, it's very good for the students, and it's good for the local community. And finally now, one completely different one. When I was in Penang one time, I was just very fortunate to see an exhibition of student work from one academy. And the theme of this was the past, present, and future of Penang. And this one's really interesting. First of all, it's in a public park, so it's available to everyone. That's how I was able to see it. They've used the shipping containers as the background for the artwork, which is good because Penang is a port. And then they've done the graffiti art on the shipping containers. So again, this is a really good example of how we can push art out into the community. And finally, I want to consider the person who epitomizes exactly what I mean by everyday art. His name is Dale Chihuly. He sculptures in glass, and his glass works are the most beautiful things I've seen. And he only takes on public commissions. He said he wants everyone to appreciate his artwork. So he does no private commissions, it's all public commissions. And so he was commissioned by the Singapore government to create artworks for Singapore. And when he does his commissions, he goes into the local community, he finds out what the culture is of the local community, he looks at the context of where his art is going to be displayed, and then he creates artwork that is specific to the culture and specific to the location. And so he was asked to produce arts for the gardens in the bay in Singapore. Now, this is one example of his work. You can see there he's got glass bushes. You can see the real bushes there, and you can see his glass bushes. And then the curvy green things are actually representing herons. So he's represented flora and fauna in this particular artwork. Here's another example of his work. This represents water lilies in a pond. Again, it is highly contextual and appropriate and relevant and beautiful. And another example are tulips. So along one of the pathways, he's got some tulips sprouting out, which is a typical thing that a landscape gardener would do, is to have some flowers and to brighten it up. Beautiful example of everyday art. So to conclude, everyday art is art for and in the community that is valued and then becomes part of our culture because it is valued and therefore becomes preserved as our heritage. So thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope that I've encouraged you to think about environmental aesthetics and how it can be applied, and I hope that some of you might take it on. And as I said, the previous speaker mentioned about art curriculum. Maybe environmental aesthetics should be an essential part of all curriculum for the arts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Britton, for the very insightful presentation on the everyday art and how it should be embedded in our everyday lives. All right, Doctor, I see a question in the chat box. Shall I read it out to you?
Yes, thank you.
All right, dear Prof. With the intensification of urbanization happening across Southeast Asia, some megacities may have limited funds to eco-engineer parts of their built environment into a more aesthetic, eye-pleasing urban landscape. So how possible it is to focus on the eco-designs which are more ecologically functional based on biomimetic principles, but not necessarily humanly aesthetically pleasing?
Yes, well, that's a really difficult question to answer. Of course, I mean, if I take the history of Singapore, they wanted to industrialize rapidly, so they just did it the traditional way, and that's why you ended up with that horrible industrial drain. If there is limited funds, it can be difficult, but again, there are sponsors out there, and I think what you need to realize is even if governments are slow to respond, and it seems to be that the governments are the problem, the good part of it is that the companies, and particularly say some of these hedge funds now, they're becoming very environmentally conscious and socially conscious. So you can tap them for funds. So it doesn't have, if a government can't afford it, they can always tap some of these funds to try and do it. And again, if you're looking at it, you want to provide a nice environment for your people. So yes, there is some cost to it, but if you look at the cost of, if they'd started with that Keo Park first, and without putting the drain in, if you look at the cost of producing that floodplain to producing the drain, then that removing it and creating it, it probably isn't that high at all. Now, for some areas, it is difficult, I have to admit. Maybe you've got a drain through a city. I'll take an example of Johor. Then you may not be able to create a floodplain. But then what they did in Johor and what they've also done in Singapore is it doesn't have to be an open drain. You can cover it and then you can plant over it and you can create a walkway, which is what they've done in Johor, and they've also done that in Singapore. I hope that answers the question.
All right, thank you, Dr. Britton. Now I would like to invite again Dr. Ruslan, Dr. Britton, and the Professor Vice Chancellor, together with all the viewers. Let's have a very brief photography session. Okay, viewers, you can turn on the video or photo button on your screen, on the bottom of your Zoom app screen, and I will count now. Okay, are we ready? All right, let's have the photography session, yeah? In the count of 3, 1, 2, and 3. Okay, let's do another one in the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. And let's have a freestyle one, shall we? In the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. All right, we have it, okay. Thank you very much. Now, participants and viewers, we will have a short break before we proceed to the paper presentation session.